The phone woke me like a slap-thin plastic ring breaking the kind of sleep you only get when the world is still loud enough to drown it out. I fumbled for the receiver with the hand that still smelled like last night's cheap bourbon and the ashtray under my nightlamp. The line was a mouthful of hush, and then a man's voice soft enough to be dangerous. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, "check your desk. There is an envelope. Don't open it on the street." He sounded like a lawyer because he was a lawyer, clipped consonants. The faint reek of linen and the way polite men say things that are threats in suits. I told him he had the wrong number. He said nothing. The line clicked, and I was alone with the buzz in my ears and the fluorescent hum of the street lamp outside, the heat already sweating through the blinds. My office was a third floor room above a dive that sold bad coffee and better whiskey. The rent was late, the radiator sang, the floor had cigarette burns mapped like constellations. Bourbon Street's gutter drums were far but never quiet, a low jazz that whispered through the walls. I pulled on yesterday's shirt, boots, and went for the door. The envelope was on the desk like a gift-wrapped lie, cheap manila, no stamp, no return placed over the ledger where I kept the list of names who wanted me dead or broke. On top of it sat a photograph, glossy and smelling faintly of cologne and something sweeter, maybe Vivienne's perfume. Her face hit me like lightning. Vivienne Dupré, as clean and cruel as a society portrait, high cheekbones, a mouth that could smile ruin, hair pinned with a rotunda of pearls and a carnival mask tucked at the edge like she'd been born half-hidden. She was the kind of heiress you read about in gossip columns and cautionary tales. Dupré money went back 2 centuries and came with traditions, trustees, and people who never forgot they owned things. She'd been missing 3 days according to the anonymous scrawl on the back of the photo that said "Find Vivienne." Help! The writing was hurried, the letters curling like someone had scratched them in the dark. Beneath the photograph, wrapped in tissue like contraband, was a voodoo doll the size of my palm. It was crude linen stuffed with sawdust, its mouth a crooked stitch, its limbs oddly lopsided. Black thread held its cloudy button eyes in place, but they looked at me the way windows look at burglars. Someone had tied a bead necklace around its neck. I knew that necklace. I knew because I had sold it last month. I ran a thumb over the beads, little red and silver rounds, the kind tourists loved because they looked expensive and never were. I remembered the buyer, Remy LeBlanc, a man with more charm than principles who sold other men's things back to them on the quarter. He'd come in with breath like river water and a grin that didn't believe in closing. He'd shaken my hand, said he'd turn it into profit for both our sakes, and left me with bills on my tongue. I hadn't seen him since, a few nights after Remy. I lost another stack at the table to a dealer with a face like a purse and the patience of a saint. The debt collectors started calling not long after. Fat Tuesday glowed on the calendar like an execution date. The cards in my wallet were all broken promises. The people waiting outside my door were patients with guns. The ledger, me life in 2 columns, said I had 10 days. 10 days till the parade swallowed the city and men with bad tempers, and worse aim came looking for their dues. If I couldn't square this, I'd be doing something final and violent to my ledger and possibly myself. I sat and unfolded the photo of Vivienne again. She looked at me like a woman who'd never been interrupted before. The back of the picture had a smudge of mascara and a name I hadn't expected, Dupré. My grandfather had muttered the name once in a church confession, and the memory curled in my chest like a fishbone. The idea that someone had put her picture on my desk like trash and vanished followed the lawyer's voice from the night before. Who hired the lawyer? Why me? My license said private investigator, not miracle worker. The doll's sewn eyes were lazy and obscene. Up close, the stitches ran through the cotton like little highways. The bead necklace clicked when I picked it up, the sound small and personal. I said Remy's name out loud to the empty room. The sound of it made me taste river water and heavy tobacco. Down on bourbon. A trumpet held a single note for longer than it had a right to. And grease hissed on a short-order grill. The quarter smelled like powdered sugar, old money, and the open wounds of the city. People in masks laughed under the glow of neon. A woman with a feather boa laughed too loud and threw her head back like she was trying to dislodge the world. It was the kind of place where you could pretend at salvation until the last bead fell from your hand. I put the doll beside the ledger, looped my thumb through the necklace, and tried to work the file into a shape that meant something. My head was still full of dust from too many late nights and too many losses. My gut, my real idiot compass, tugged me toward one name. Remy, my brain collused, reluctant. Said find out who wanted Vivienne found and what they were willing to do to a gambler who is behind on his debts. The knock came like a drum roll missing its joke, not a polite knock. Heavy 3 times, then a pause. Then a hand pounding the wood like it owed the building money. The kind of knock that meant a man had been waiting too long. Open up, Hargrove. A voice called low and flat as a grave. It wasn't my name. It was the name they'd used in the papers when the city decided to crucify me for a night, Hargrove. The alias that stuck to the scandal that cost me a badge and a marriage and everything you could pawn before dawn. The name that meant they'd come looking for things I couldn't pay for. The doll's sewn eyes looked at me and didn't blink. The beads caught the light and flashed like a warning. The trumpet outside hit a new note. High and frantic, and in the doorway a shadow waited like death. Remy's place was a postcard for bad decisions, a back room above a fish market, ceiling low enough to make every voice feel like a secret. The smell of stale sweat and spilled gin hung in the air. A half-dozen men hunched over a crooked table, cards smudged with grease. The kind of room where luck came wrapped in cigarette ash and someone always claimed moral high ground between shuffles. Remy was thinner than the memory had told me, all elbows and nervous teeth. He kept his hair long like a promise. He refused to keep, and he wore a shirt that had once been white. When I walked in, the game slowed as if the room had taken a breath from me. I put the doll S-bead necklace on the table between us like a bet. You lost that to me, Jack, Remy said, fingers tracing the beads. His voice had the same oily charm. You selling old junk now. Times are hard. You sold it, I said. To you, he shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. Lots of hands in this town. He tried a smile that didn't make it past his jaw. What do you want, Marlowe? The old name was a slice. I leaned forward, the light catching the beads so they flashed cheap and red. Vivienne Dupré, where did you see her last? The room exhaled. A man folded his cards like a map and left. Remy fiddled with a cigarette, then lit it slow as confession. Masked ball, he said. LaRue Mask, 2 nights before she vanished. She came with a woman, black feathers, and a laugh too loud. I thought it was a party, people in pretty cages, Jack. But Duprees aren't tea for public meals. She was there, though. She was dancing with an old man who smelled like my grandfather's whiskey. Who was he? I asked. I don't tea no names, Remy said. I know favors. I know what people will pay to pretend they weren't tea there. Lots of money shifts hands at those balls. You want the truth. You want to look at ledgers. You want to look where people keep their sins on paper. He blinked so fast I could see the white of it. He wanted the money he still owed me back. Wanted my silence about the beads. I wanted answers and I hadn't. Tea got them with nothing but my conscience and a compass that kept pointing toward trouble. The beads had put me on the trail, and Remy had just handed me a place to dig. The Dupré townhouse sat like a museum of old money, shutters trimmed in iron lace. A carriageway turned parking spot for a rusted Lexus. A front stoop polished by hands that smelled like lavender and litigation. I circled the block twice because I always circled blocks I couldn't afford to walk into straight. The quarter was warming, and Mardi Gras felt like a heartbeat you could hear from blocks away. Brass laughter, the scent of sugar being torched in street carts. I slipped through a side alley that smelled of citrus and mold, found the servant. Entrance unlocked. No lock at all, really. Just courtesy between the house and the world, and took the stairs 2 at a time. The back of these houses had secrets in every shadow. Rich men hide things in attics, richer men hide them in plain sight. Upstairs, the house breathed money. Portraits watched me like they knew my name. I moved slow, hands in my pockets, listening for arrangements of sound. The study was smaller than the house, but tidy as a confession on the desk, beneath a paperweight that was more jewelry than office supply. I found a ledger. It blended in leather and dust. But once you know what to look for, you see the blood tracks of the city, names, dates, numbers. Figures written in a hand that hid its own tremor. Amounts moved between columns like tides. I skimmed names, lawyers, restaurateurs, a banking chair, a foundation nobody had ever questioned. Next to each name, amounts and, on some entries, a note in tiny, precise script, Ball Masqué, Frenchman. Late, favors exchanged. The numbers weren't tea charity. They were ledgers of hush, money favors, payoffs, a map of influence disguised as bookkeeping. There was a column I almost missed, the margins pressed with a code, letters, and small crosses that could mean ledger pages. Could mean corpses Vivienne. S name was there, circled twice in black ink. The sum beside it made my hands go cold. Whatever secret this book kept, it was big enough to topple men who liked being above the law. I wasn't alone when I closed the book. A mirror on the far wall caught a movement. A man in a dark suit leaning against the doorway like he wanted to be somewhere else but knew better. He had the slick hair of someone who still believed in charm and a smile that had killed careers in better times. His eyes were the keen blue of a rival who'd been waiting for me to find something interesting. "Jack," he said. The name a coin tossed between us. "You should." V stayed sleeping. It wasn't surprise in his voice. It was calculation. He introduced himself as Miles Crane, private investigator, too polished for this neighborhood, and probably too hungry for a liquor. Stained file, to be honest. He told me he had a client, someone who didn't want the ledger to move, and who had the means to make sure the ledger stayed where it wouldn't. Caused trouble before I could ask why he was helping the Duprés. The assistant to the assistant of law enforcement stepped into the room. Lieutenant Pascal Boudreau. A man who wore corruption like perfume. He carried the badge of a city that pretended to clean its streets and then wiped down its boots. He'd been on the scene of my scandal years ago. He had a memory for faces, and a file lined with favors. "Mr. Marlowe," Boudreau said, voice buttery. "Louisiana syrup hiding knives. This is above your pay grade. I advise you to walk away." Miles smiled, the kind of smile that wants to be a handshake and ends up a chokehold. Boudreau's eyes flicked to the ledger and then to me. He didn't need to say what would happen if I took the book out into the light. I saw it in the way his fingers brushed his service weapon, and didn't he adjust his cuffs outside. The quarter was darker than it had been when I came in. Someone had posted my face on 3 telephone poles, glossy and big, Marlowe. Delinquent, outstanding debt. The world had a way of reminding you of the price tag hanging off your throat. I thought of the beads of Remy's cigarette ash, of the names in the ledger. If this book got loose, men with tenure would fall. If it stayed, Vivienne might rot wherever they put her. I left the house with the taste of old money in my mouth, and 2 men warning me away. My choices weren't good. They were lesser and lesser, and the river of decisions was narrowing with every step toward Mardi Gras. I ducked into a doorway to avoid a crew of tourists, and felt the phone buzz against my hip. A text from an unknown number lit the screen. The picture that loaded was grainy, the kind of image taken quick with a phone hand trembling. Vivienne, bound eyes wide, a cloth gag red with something darker than lipstick. The caption stamped the image, like an executioner. S. Frenchman, Saint 9 days to Fat Tuesday. Marie found me, like all saints find sinners, in a doorway, trying to look less lost than I felt. Her shrine sat behind the kind of storefront that pretended to sell beads and postcards and sold other things to those who knew the back wall. The room smelled like river mud and roasted coffee, beeswax and something older. Copper and rain and the kind of smoke that sticks to your lungs like a promise. She was smaller than I expected, shirt sleeves rolled to show forearms, inked with names I didn't ask about. Candles pooled wax on the floor and rings, shells and bones lay arranged like punctuation. A crucifix hung where a photograph might have been. Her eyes were dark and patient, and when she looked at the doll on my palm, they widened. Not in superstition, but in someone reading a line of a bad book and recognizing the villain. "This piece," she said, tapping the linen with a painted nail. Her voice sounded like dry leaves. "The stitch is not simple, it is a warning. Someone sent it to speak for them." I told her what little truth I had. The beads, Remy, the photographer's note, the ledger in a Dupré study, and she hummed a breath that seemed to move the candles. I wasn't a believer of the sort that lit candles for favors. I believed in odds and gumshoe work and the kind of God who collects tips at the back door. Marie made me rethink my math. "You have debts," she said. And it wasn't accusation so much as accounting. And debts make men careless. Careless men make mistakes. "You have a mistake in your palm." She pinched the doll's ear like a mother checking a fever. The doll twitched under her fingers the way something might if you half expected it to. She wanted a favor, not for free. Nothing in New Orleans was free. She wanted me to find a ledger page stolen from her client book, a page that proved who paid her for what, which meant who had secrets they would kill to keep. She said someone had taken a page and sold it to a fence who trafficked in paper and small sins. She named the place a second-line rehearsal hall on Frenchman, where men with brass instruments blew practice until the moon gave up listening. The fence called Grady or Graft. I couldn't tell the difference moved things for a living. Marie wanted that page back. "If you do this," she said, palming a small glass bottle that smelled of citrus and bay leaves, "I will read the doll true. I will turn your warning into a map." I hated owing favors. I owed more than I liked to admit. But the idea of a ledger full of names people who paid to hide things made my teeth ache in the way it does when you smell money. I took the favor. The rehearsal hall was a corrugated roof building that made the brass sound raw and closer to bone. Men tuned and warmed, laughter like low percussion. I slipped through a side door someone had left unlatched because musicians didn't lock out the night. Nobody expected the night to come with a warrant. Grady was fat in the way city fences were, a belly full of secrets and a charm bracelet of past hits. He sat with paperwork spread like a king counting coins, smoke coiling from a cigar like an exclamation. The ledger page was there, half-folded, the handwriting the same neat script Marie described. It had names I expected and names I didn't. At the bottom, a note: auction float allocations. Bid winners to deliver, Mardi Gras. I didn't need to be smarter than ambition to see what that meant. Someone was auctioning favors that would be laundered through the city's floats, a clandestine market where influence bought space and safety, and somebody had shelled out for Vivienne. I reached for the paper. Grady smiled like I'd offered him a tip. "You're not the first fox through my henhouse, Marlowe. What gives you the right a rough hand closed my mouth for me?" I'd heard the click of boots more often than I cared to, and those boots belonged to the men who thought threats should be applied in person. Debt collectors, they knew my face. My failures. One of them wore Remy's scent like a badge, river water and smoke. They'd followed me or been tipped or lived in the seams of this city's gossip. Either way, they had come. The room tightened. Music died mid-note. Grady laughed then, a bark that meant betrayal is profitable until it isn't. He had his hand on the paper and the men had their hands where they wanted them, on my shoulders and my wrists, on the throat of my luck. There should have been a confession then. Instead, there was a trumpet that started up outside like a god who'd had enough of small men arguing. I went for the side door because it was the only place that wasn't another man with an idea. I don't remember the dash as much as I remember the sound of brass chasing me and a pain that bloomed across my side when a fist found the ribs it needed. I hit the alley like a man coming out of a bad dream. Chest sweating, the page wet in my palm, more from my fingers than from anything else. They followed for a while. I thought the city would swallow me. Narrow alleys, high walls, the river just a rumor on the breeze. I ran with the ledger's truth folded inside my shirt and my lungs burning, like I was trying to answer for something I hadn't admitted to yet. I lost them where the quarter opens up near the river, where the tourists lined up like saints and the brass was a hymn again. I ducked into a crowd and pretended to be gone. The fragment I had wasn't whole. It was a corner of a conspiracy. But where it was clear, the ink screamed, mayor's office, float allocations, auction winners. Vivienne's name crossed with a bid amount that matched the sum next to a councilman's name I'd seen in the Dupré ledger. Marie was waiting when I found her. How long she'd been at the shrine, I couldn't say. She took the paper with hands that didn't shake and pressed it to the candlelight, like you press a coin to a lover's photograph. Her face went flat as a grave. "This," she said, her voice a slow peal, "is not only the city's filth, it ties to those who lead the parade. They wear beads and they also bury things." She picked up the doll. The room's candlelight bent around her. She picked a long black pin from a cushion and held it poised over the linen chest, as if she were about to close a wound rather than make a point. She leaned close to the doll, lips barely moving, and muttered names like prayers. I listened because I wanted to know what saints and sinners she thought would look like when judged. Then, steady as a gavel and soft as a lullaby, she pressed the pin into the doll's chest and spoke one name so quietly. It should have been swallowed by the wax, Lucien Marchand. St. Louis Cemetery at midnight was a city of bones lit by a lazy moon. The oaks dripped Spanish moss like old men with handkerchiefs. The air tasted of damp stone and magnolia and something sweeter, jazz spilling faint from a bar 2 blocks over. A trumpet that sounded like a confession. I moved like a shadow that had a reason to be there. Ledger fragment folded in my pocket, beads warm against my palm where I'd thumbed them raw as prayer. The gate protested with a long metal sigh. I ducked between iron posts and the dead, stepping around the above-ground tombs that crowded the paths like impatient neighbors. Cemetery records were the kind of paper that told you who paid for what, who gave to whom, the little legal breadcrumbs the living leave behind. I had a hunch and a scrap of paper, and that combination will get you in trouble or answers in this town. The records were in a small office behind a statue that smelled like old incense and rain. I picked the lock because I had to, because the men who posted my face had no patience left for waiting. Inside, drawers full of yellow pages and ledger books kept the city's polite lies. I worked fast, fingers cold, under a lamplight that made everything look smaller and more true. Names lined up like jurors, donations, to float committees, amounts, addresses. The ledger fragment I had fit into the map on the page like a missing tooth. Someone was laundering favors through parade allocations, money paid to secure space on a float, to get a private cabana on parade day, to keep a public problem out of the press, and the names attached to the payments were not small men. Lucien Marchand showed up next to a donation that matched the sum beside Vivienne's name in the Dupré ledger. The mayor's office had entries of its own, routed through a councilman's charity and then washed through an account listed under a parade supplier. I copied the pages with a shaky hand. I read the entries twice, 3 times, until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and started looking like decisions. Whoever had paid for Vivienne's silence hadn't done it quietly enough. They'd auctioned safety like a seat at a table, and someone had bid, and when Vivienne refused to sign, she became a liability. I followed the breadcrumb address from the records like a hound. Lucien Marchand, city official and parade committee chair. Left his office in a suit that smelled faintly of citrus and law. He moved with the assuredness of a man accustomed to being invisible in plain sight. He flagged a town car, gave directions, and rolled through the quarter with that comfortable air of someone who thinks rules are for other people. He went to a warehouse down by the river, an ugly place where the air smelled of varnish and diesel, and the night kept its mouth shut. Floats were hulks of papier-mâché, and promise, hulking things that get dressed and fed before they parade. The warehouse was a throat where the city's public face and private greed got dressed. I kept to the shadows, slipping through loading docks and past a pair of men who nodded like they'd seen a ghost before. Inside, the floats were half-made godheads, shapes of 10-20 feet of color drying under work lights. Men hammered and painted and laughed with hands that had lived longer than they admitted. Lucien stepped between them like a director, overseeing, signing receipts, accepting boxes. He leaned close to a crate the size of a coffin, staff around him, papers in hand. The crate had a shipping label, a storage code that matched the cemetery ledger entry in a way that made me think the two places were speaking the same language. I didn't have a warrant. I didn't have any backup. I had a debt and a stubbornness that made me do the wrong thing at the right time. I slipped to the far side of the floor, trying to be less a man and more a breeze. I got close enough to hear the tail end of a conversation between 2 men with badges and the smell of cheap cologne, one of them Lucien's lieutenant. Another a bureaucrat with a mouth like a safe. She refused, I heard. Clear as a bell on Sunday, refused to sign the release. She made a statement, now she is a risk. Handle it quietly, someone said. The word handle had a neat, mechanical sound. No scandals. Parade goes on. There was the reason. Vivienne had been paid to stay silent. She'd turned down the check. That was courage or stupidity. In this town, the two looked strikingly similar and equally dangerous. I moved and a nail caught my shoe. A light flashed like the start of a fight. Men saw me. The chase wasn't cinematic. It was grunt and breath and the sound of steps crashing over metal and wood. I ran under a balcony that smelled of cigarettes and fried food, up a narrow fire escape with paint flaking on the rungs. They followed, boots hammering like justice with a stick. Bourbon Street at midnight is a living thing, a ribbon of noise, neon, laughter, brass. I used the balconies, wrought iron, like the teeth of a city to get ahead, vaulting from one to the next with a desperate kind of prayer. I misjudged a jump, and the iron bit my palm. Pain bloomed white-hot across my knuckles, and I tasted old whiskey and copper. They cornered me at a narrow passage, faces like slabs. One of them wore the uniform of a lieutenant I knew by reputation, an undersized Conscience Pascal Boudreaux. He smiled like a man settling a debt. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, voice smooth as molasses and twice as sticky. "You need to stop this." I was still gasping. My ribs felt like they'd been counted. Adrenaline wore thin and the ledger pages in my inside pocket felt like a promise with a hand around its throat. "You can take me in," I said. "You can try to erase what I saw. You can threaten me with jail and talk about cleaning up the parade. But I found a ledger and I saw the name. Vivienne won't be safe if you bury this." Boudreaux's smile tightened until it looked like a warning. He leaned in close enough for me to smell his cologne clean, expensive. The kind of man wears to hide his history. "Drop it," he said. "For your sake, walk away and we'll forget about your past. Keep poking and you'll be arrested for trespass. For theft, for anything we need to make you quiet, or worse, Marlowe. You still owe men who don't accept excuses." There was the old scandal, the name Hargrove in the dark. The weight of it on my lungs. I thought of the ledger of Lucian's crate, of Vivienne with beads in her hair. I thought of the doll in Marie's hands, of a pin and a name. I thought of debts that weren't just money. I pocketed the copy I'd made and let the crowd swallow me. I didn't promise. I don't promise things I won't keep. If they wanted me silenced, they'd have to start with my boots. I walked back toward the warehouse with the slow certainty of a man who'd chosen the road he hated. The crate was labeled with a number, weathered stenciling. I had a crowbar and a cheap flashlight and the kind of resolve that comes from standing with your back against a clock. The wood gave with a groan inside. In the stink of oil and varnish and sweat was a woman curled like an afterthought. Vivienne's hair was a nest of dark curls, threaded with Mardi Gras beads, her wrists bound with twine, her eyes blinking raw and alive. Beside her sat the same voodoo doll from my desk, linen dirty, button eyes unblinking. She looked at me the way people look at someone who owes them a miracle. She didn't look like the heiress in glossy magazines when I knelt beside her. Vivienne Dupré looked like somebody's scared cousin, pale hair a halo of beads, mascara run into the gullies of her cheeks. The twine had cut tracks into her wrists. Her breath came in ragged money. I cut the knots with a pocket knife that had seen better bets and worse nights. "Don't he move," I said, "because the first lie you tell a trapped woman is that you can fix anything." She blinked at me like she was checking the world for betrayals. I thought I could buy a lane out. She said when I eased the gag free, voice small and shocky. I staged a disappearance so my people would stop forcing me into the alliances. Marchand-S office wanted me to sign. To make the story go away, I refused. They paid other people to be quiet, then they paid the wrong people. She tasted like sugar and fear, and the beads in her hair chimed when she shifted. Her fingers searched for the doll at her side, found it, clutched it like a rosary. "The ledger," she whispered. "It is not just hush money, it is ballots, Jack. Donations split into ghost accounts. Funds routed to places they shouldn't. TB, ballots bought, seats promised. If that ledger goes federal, people go down. Elections change, indictments happen. Judges, the mayor's office, a councilman, it is all there." She had staged parts of this, she said. An escape hatch crafted to get her out of a corner where the city threaded favors through floats and called it celebration. She hadn't expected it to end with wooden crates and men with badges who smelled like alibis. She named a trustee who promised sanctuary. Someone inside the Duper circle who been a friend, his counsel. It turned out had a different price. We needed someone who could move on a ledger that could topple a parade committee and split a city. Local cops were a joke or a co-conspirator. So I called a number I had tucked away the way you tuck away bullets. Federal agents move slower, but they keep cleaner books. I asked for a meeting, and I asked for it in a place where noise masked whispers. A bakery that moonlighted as a coffee shop when the city slept. King cake in the display window, bright purple and gold. A plastic baby sunning on powdered sugar like a lie. Agent Claire Hollis met me at a back table with a styrofoam cup and suspicion. She was the kind of woman whose badge didn't need to clatter to be loud. She looked at Vivienne the way people look at hurricanes. "Planning routes, measuring losses, you. B got something interesting," Hollis said, thumb worrying the rim of her cup. But New Orleans eats informants for breakfast, your ledger ties to municipal accounts, campaign funds, and a parade committee that falls under federal interest when money launders across state lines. We can move, Mr. Marlowe, but not until we make sure the no-BD isn't tea-brooming footprints under the rug. She said the name Boudreaux slow, as if tasting the danger. If Lieutenant Boudreaux or his boys have fingers on this, we need proof they aren't going to bury a complaint. We need secure custody of the ledger and testimony. Yours, Vivienne S. We can offer relocation and witness protection, but not for unpaid debts with collectors who don't care about subpoenas. I told her what I knew about the warehouse, about the crate, about March and TS shipping codes. She wanted the ledger. She wanted the original. She wanted chain of custody. I wanted Vivienne somewhere safe and a way to make my creditors stop circling like carrion birds. The conversation felt like trading in second-hand prayers. We can protect her if you let us move, Hollis said. Give us the ledger tonight, and we move at daybreak. We LL set up an arrest. Unseal indictments and my creditors, I interrupted. They don't care about indictments, they care about blood money and quick collections. She didn't smile. Federal agents can guarantee protection from private actors. We can arrest and seize. That may deter them. But if your enemies are connected to the very men we re-investigating, if the no PD flips, then handing over your only leverage is like handing over a throat. It was the choice I always hated, hand over the thing that could change everything and hope the law was cleaner than the streets. Or hold on to it and hope my luck outpaced men who didn't mind breaking bones to close a ledger. Vivienne, listening, touched my sleeve. I didn't plan to be a martyr, she said. I wanted to run. I wanted to free myself from the contracts they written in other people's hands. I didn't know they hire their friends to make my escape final. We made a plan that looked like comprehension on paper. Hollis would bring a team at dawn if I put the ledger in a secure place. She wanted custody by sunrise. I talked as if I could trade the ledger for a broken life rebuilt. Protection for Vivienne, immunity for me, money to square with men who marked me in chalk. She said federal coffers didn't cover gambling debts. When I walked out, the quarter was waking up. Beads already doubling like prayers on the stoops. The city smelled like king cake and gasoline. I had the ledger tucked against my chest and a map stamped in my head of courthouses and warehouses. I had hope the size of a coin and faith the size of a match. Then my phone lit a threat. 2 words. Deliver or else. An image of my office door and a time, midnight. No signature. The same collectors who, been patient like pit bulls, now had tongues of fire. There was a card with my face on it, posted in 3 new places. A glossy PSA delinquent, turn in now. And another note slid under my door. Very specific. Turn the ledger to Miles Crane at Anne and Burgundy at 3 a.m. Bring the ledger. Bring no one. Do it and you LL live. Miles had offered help earlier, smooth and smiling and expensive. He said he could broker introductions, could get the ledger to someone with power without dragging the no-bead into embarrassment. He smelled like a clean suit and a job well sold. I should have known there were no saints in slacks. I should have known favors come with receipts. On the eve of Fat Tuesday, Miles Crane betrayed me. I'd been set up to be arrested at dawn. As men moved to claim the ledger, Canal Street felt like the throat of the city that day, brass and exhaust, and 1,000 voices shoved into one long shout. Floats rolled slow as funerals and twice as loud, glitter throwing itself at the sun. People wore masks like promises. Firecrackers popped like the city had a nervous tick. I kept my hands around the ledger until the ink ached through the paper. Vivienne's fingers pressed against my wrist like she was checking for the pulse of a man who hadn't learned to stay alive. Agent Hollis had a van parked between 2 news trucks, their satellite dishes pointing up like questions. She looked smaller in the square of open air. But paper and the law make ladies of iron. She mouthed the plan, hand off, secure the ledger, move Vivienne. The crowd was a living thing, an ocean of purple and gold with cameras rolling everywhere. Phones, TV, the occasional live feed spilling into the world's attention. We moved through bodies that smelled of fried dough and perfume, and the honest sweat of people who thought the day was about celebration. Masks bobbed. I kept looking for faces I knew. Miles Crane, the Polish betrayer. Boudreaux's badge dark under a shirt that never saw sunlight. Lucien marching like a director of chaos with citrus on his cuffs. Halfway down canal, I saw the balcony where men like to watch parades like kings on thrones. Today, the balcony had more teeth than most suits, badges, a man with that self-satisfied air of someone who'd never had to answer for the things he bought. Marchand's consigliere stood there, a shadow in a silk tie. Beside him was Lieutenant Boudreaux, and a narrow panic, and then Miles mingling like a charming rabid dog. We didn't get the quiet handoff Hollis wanted. A kid with a camera ran by and pressed live. A broadcaster's mic picked up the brass and then a cough, and for a sliver of a second the ledger's edges glinted in the sun, like a confession. Simona fired from a balcony. The sound cut the air sharp as a knife. People screamed and dove. Glass shattered like the city had decided to wake up and punish itself. Bullets ripped the float's fringe and nicked a man in a sequin jacket who'd been laughing a second before. A gunfight bloomed above us on the wrought iron. Boudreaux's men on one side, Marchand's consigliere and another suited thug on the other. An argument that used lead instead of words. Miles moved like a maning who'd rehearsed desperation. He lunged for the ledger while I jerked to keep Vivienne behind me. He was fast because he had no heartbeat left to be ashamed of. I traded a punch for a hand on the book. The ledger slid, pages fanning like a heart, and then a man's elbow knocked it toward the float's edge. That was when I did the stupidest, bravest thing I could think of. I vaulted up onto a float. One of those monstrous things with speakers, the size of small cars and a live mic blaring some Mardi Gras anthem. The loudspeakers thrummed the city's nerves. The broadcast truck's camera was already trained on the scene thanks to the kids' live stream. I grabbed the mic with hands that smelled of cigarette and old promises and said the names out loud. Lucien Marchand, I said, my voice bleeding into the speakers that swallowed everything. Mayor's office funds, Councilman Belarus, payoffs through float allocations. Ballots bought. Vivienne Dupré paid to be silent. This ledger proves it. The sound ricocheted down canal like a verdict. Heads turned. The cameras lifted, hungry for the first time since the beads had hit my palm. I saw the city's face change, curiosity sharpening into outrage. The balcony men realized they'd lost the private room the city had given them. Reporters snapped pictures. Phones streamed my confession into millions of hands. Boudreaux saw his chance. He swore something, a syllable like acid, and dove toward the float. Miles was already there, scrabbling, desperate for the pages. I felt a sting across my shoulder. The bite of a graze, but I kept the mic and kept shouting names like they were shots. Vivienne's hand gripped mine until the pulse at her wrist stuttered. Agent Hollis moved faster than I expected. She cut through the chaos with two agents at her back, pinned Julio. Anna Marchand's men before he could reach the ledger. Claire's face was a map of tired decisions and iron. She took the ledger from the float as if it were an infant you give to the right mother. Her hands were careful, professional. She wrapped it in an evidence bag with a speed that looked like choreography and then turned for the van. "Get Vivienne out," she barked. Now, I had one card left, one stupid bet. If I let Claire walk off with the ledger, federal custody could mean indictments, subpoenas, protection for witnesses, maybe a shot at cleaning something so rotten it had grown teeth. But if I followed, Miles and Boudreaux would shadow us for the kill. So I did what men like me do when we finally understand the odds are a joke. I put everything on the table. I stepped away from the van and raised my hands where cameras could see them. Boudreaux's face tightened like a fist. Miles howled like a dog who'd been denied. Reporters crowded in, phones jabbing. Hollis looked at me, the ledger tucked in an evidence bag under her arm, and something flickered across her face. A nod, small-pocketed hope. "You'll arrest me," I said to Boudreaux. Loud enough they could all hear. "Take me, call it theft. Call it whatever makes your headlines clean. But she is with federal custody now, and that ledger is sealed. You want me, here I am." Boudreaux's hand hovered over cuffs. For a second I thought he wouldn't do it. For a split second he considered the optics of arresting a man live in a parade. Then he snapped the cuffs on my wrists like a man snapping a book shut. Cameras loved the drama. The crowd roared, half in rage, half in triumph. Hollis didn't smile. She slid the evidence bag into the van and slammed the door. Vivienne, wrapped in a blanket, was led by an agent I didn't know to a side entrance. Claire stopped long enough to meet my eyes, and she nodded once. Just once, a small, private assurance that the ledger was where it needed to be. My hands closed around cold metal. Sirens wailed in the distance. Cameras kept rolling. My chest felt hollow and full at once, like a coin about to be flipped, and the world holding its breath to see which side would show. The holding cell smelled like bleach and old mistakes. The bars were thin as excuses and twice as loud. I sat on a steel bench and watched my hands, the same hands that had gripped a microphone and shouted names into a float speaker, now asked to be quiet by the cold geometry of metal. They brought subpoenas like rain stacks of paper with federal seals that made the city seem smaller and more honest than it felt. Someone somewhere decided to make a clean line through the mess we'd ripped open. And for once the line led away from me. Agent Hollis came through the glass with a face that had learned to be both sentence and mercy. She slid a paper across, the kind of legal thing that smells faintly of lacquer and obligation. "You'll be held for questioning," she said. "There is a lot of noise now. Indictments are being drafted. Marchin Belarus people you named are under seal. They won't move on you today, Jack. But your status is complicated." Complicated was polite. She didn't promise bail. She didn't lie. The ledger had lit a bonfire. Embers were still falling. People with names on those pages were waking up to new lives full of courtrooms and subpoenas. The city's parade committee dissolved like sugar in hot coffee. Reporters put faces to ledgers. Men who thought themselves invisible were suddenly visible in handcuffs and headline reels. That was the part that made me breathe easier and kept my feet from flying out from under me. People were being dragged into sunlight whether they wanted it or not. Between intake and interviews, I found time to think about numbers and beaded necklaces and the stupid mathematics that had led me here. $1 lost at a table. A debt that grew teeth. A small linen doll that looked like a joke until it wasn't. I thought about Vivienne, the way beads caught in her hair like contraband, and the way she had stood with me on a float while bullets and brass and cameras decided which side of history they'd be on. Witnesses came forward as if the ledger were a bell and someone had finally learned how to ring it. A clerk who'd been paid through a shell account, a driver who had photographed his shipment names, whispered into the right ears. The ledger did what ledgers do. It invited pen to follow pen and people to follow paper. Creditors who'd been breathing on my neck for weeks fell strangely quiet when federal subpoenas started showing up at the doors of men who'd always been polite about violence. Money prefers certainty, even when that certainty is an indictment. I learned, in the hours that stretched between questions, that being useful is not the same as being safe. Hollis told me plainly that the feds could not stand in for private thugs if men like Remy or Miles Crane decided they didn't like the new order. What they could do was move pieces on a much larger board, seize accounts, freeze assets, unmask the networks that made this city run like clockwork. It was slow work. It was also effective in a way punches and threats rarely were. Vivienne testified. I heard about it secondhand at first, through a camera feed running at a public defender's office, through the clack of a keyboard, through the low murmur of men who kept files and liked the smell of precedent. She spoke with a voice that had been knotted and was now unthreading, and she did something almost nobody in her position would. She used the freedom she'd clawed back to change the ledger's downstreams. There was a trust. There was a name on it. There were instructions to pay outstanding debts owed to certain collectors and, quietly, to settle a few accounts with people who'd been kind in ways that didn't come with publicity, Marie among them. I didn't see the money. I saw the silence where the collectors once paced. I saw my photograph come down from a telephone pole. I saw Remy's place empty, shuttered, the cards gone from the table. Little practical mercies. I also saw my name carved into more official paper. My pie license was suspended pending an inquiry. They stamped it, they took my certificate, and for the first time in a long while, my official life felt as threadbare as my clothes. People needed a fall guy. Old scandals like to reproduce Hargrove, the name that had followed me from cell blocks to courtroom whispers, made for an excellent narrative. I wasn't naive. I'd known the risk when I climbed onto that float and grabbed a mic. I had also known there are nights you gamble for the right reasons. The city needed to be cleaned in public, and someone was going to take the heat while the real rot was pried out by subpoenas and search warrants. I had the ledger in my hands. I had the audacity to make the ledger public. That made me both target and tool. They released me on my own recognizance eventually. It felt less like freedom, and more like being checked out of a hospital with a prognosis. My office on Bourbon smelled the same as it always had. Old coffee, the radiator struggling below the window, jazz leaking through a wall, but it felt different because the air held a kind of attention now. People from the neighborhood looked at me like I'd stepped out of the papers. Some nodded, some spat, most just pretended not to know me. Marie came by first, without fanfare, bringing coffee in a stained thermos, and a look that had no patience for theatrics. Vivienne's trust had sent her a check, Marie said, and she'd used it to smooth the edges where rough men might still have wanted payment. People owe you, Marie said, and not in the way you think. She didn't mention the size of the check. She didn't have to. She set a paper cup on my desk like a truce and left the way saints leave things, quietly with an expectancy. There were hearings to come. There were subpoenas with my name on them, and grand juries that wanted to know what I'd seen and whom I'd told. Miles Crane's betrayal had left more questions than answers. Some men still lurked in alleys that smelled like old money and vinegar. Boudreaux's position was under investigation. Lucien Marchand had been taken into custody. The city rocked, and in the middle of the rocking I found a small, stubborn pride that said I'd chosen a wager where the pot might actually mean something. On the desk, the voodoo doll waited. Its linen had been washed in the same river of events that had cleaned my life and stained it. Marie's pin had left a neat hole. The bead necklace I remembered hung like a rosary, familiar and ridiculous. I turned it over because old habits die hard. Because a man who reads the world in small things keeps looking for the sign that says whether he did right or not. Simone had sewn a new stitch into the doll's back. The thread was black and rough and careful. I read the name twice, because hope is a liar and the city had taught me to double-check everything. Miles Crane.